In September 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the walls of the Kremlin and watched Moscow burn. The conflagration lasted 6 days. It consumed 3/4 of the city. Temperatures grew so intense that stone structures melted. Iron church bells liquefied in their towers. Eyewitnesses described winds strong enough to lift grown men off their feet and hurl them into the flames. French soldiers reported that the air itself seemed to ignite, flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop faster than men could run. The heat was so extreme that soldiers a mile from the city center suffered burns on exposed skin. But here's what your history books don't mention. Moscow wasn't the only city engulfed. In that same year, 1812, catastrophic blazes leveled Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Caracas, Delhi, cities on opposite sides of the planet, igniting simultaneously with the same inexplicable intensity, the same impossible heat, the same total destruction. And when I traced who financed every side of the wars that supposedly caused these infernos, I found one family's name on every document, the Rothschilds. The year 1812 is taught as the year Napoleon invaded Russia, a conventional war, muskets and cavalry, artillery and tactics, soldiers freezing in the snow. 600,000 soldiers marched into Russia. Only 10,000 returned. The greatest military disaster in recorded history. An entire generation of French men erased from existence. The explanation you learned in school, Napoleon was defeated by the Russian winter and scorched earth tactics. The Russians torched their own cities rather than let the French have them. Governor Rostopchin ordered the evacuation of Moscow and the destruction of anything useful to the invaders. Case closed. Nothing to see here. Except the official story has a problem. Several problems. While Napoleon was invading Russia, a completely separate war was happening in North America, the War of 1812. British forces razed Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814. They incinerated the White House, the Capitol building, the Library of Congress, every government record, every founding document they could find. 2 simultaneous wars, 2 simultaneous conflagrations, on opposite sides of the planet, involving different armies, different governments, different supposed causes. Coincidence? Let me show you what I found when I mapped every major blaze from 1812 to 1814. Moscow, September 1812, 6 days of flames, 75% of the city destroyed, over 12,000 structures reduced to ash, churches that had stood for 300 years gone overnight. Washington, D.C., August 1814, government edifices incinerated in a single night, the glow visible from 40 miles away. A freak thunderstorm, the only one recorded that month, extinguished the flames before the entire city was lost. New York, multiple conflagrations throughout 1812 and 1813. Southern districts consumed. Entire blocks that had stood for a century, gone in hours. Insurance companies collapsed under the claims. Caracas, Venezuela, March 26, 1812. The city obliterated by what officials called an earthquake. But eyewitness accounts describe something different, something that doesn't match any seismic event in recorded history. A priest who survived wrote in his journal, "The ground did not shake, the ground burned. Heat rose from below, the structures did not fall, they melted. I saw stone flow like water. I saw iron glow red and bend. This was not the earth moving, this was the earth opening." We'll come back to that. Now here's where the money trail starts. Every war costs money. Soldiers demand pay, weapons must be purchased, supply lines require constant maintenance. Horses eat whether they march or not. Cannons don't cast themselves. Uniforms, ships, gunpowder. None of it appears from thin air. Someone has to finance all of it. In 1812, the British government turned to a German-born banker named Nathan Mayer Rothschild. According to the Rothschild archive itself, this is from their own records, their own family history, Nathan was commissioned to supply the Duke of Wellington with funds for his campaign against Napoleon. He moved gold across war-torn Europe using a network of couriers, ships, and allied banks. But Nathan wasn't just financing one side. His brother James had established a bank in Paris in 1811, 1 year before the invasion. And that bank? It was financing Napoleon's army, providing the loans that paid for French soldiers, French weapons, French supplies. Read that again. The Rothschild family was financing both sides of the Napoleonic Wars. British soldiers paid with Rothschild money were fighting French soldiers paid with Rothschild money. Every bullet fired generated interest for the same family. Every soldier killed had been financed by the same source. Why would a banking family finance both sides of a war? Because wars are profitable. The Britannica Money Encyclopedia states it directly. The wars, for the Rothschilds, meant loans to warring princes. Not victory for one side, not peace. Loans, interest, debt. Here's how it worked. Governments borrow money to fight wars. They pay interest on those loans, typically 8 to 12% annually during wartime. The longer the war continues, the more interest accumulates. And when the war ends, governments issue bonds to pay off their debts, bonds that bankers purchase at discount and redeem at full value. Nathan Rothschild didn't just finance the wars. According to historian Herbert Kaplan's research at Stanford, Nathan made massive purchases of British government bonds immediately after Waterloo, purchases that generated enormous profits when bond prices rose after the victory. Some historians estimate he made the equivalent of $1 billion in modern currency from a single day's trading, one day, while bodies still littered the battlefield. But the financing goes deeper than anyone realized. Decades after the wars ended, a document surfaced, allegedly from internal Rothschild correspondence, dated 1863. Whether authentic or reconstructed later, its logic matches the documented outcomes perfectly. The memo wasn't meant for public distribution. It was addressed to branch managers across their European banking network: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Naples. And what it said explains everything that happened in 1812. The memo identified what the Rothschilds called an existential threat to their banking model. Not a rival bank, not a competing currency, not a hostile government. Something far more dangerous: communities that didn't need banks at all. Before the 1800s, much of Europe and Asia operated under what historians call the guild system. Craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers, glassblowers, weavers, leatherworkers, shipwrights, organized into professional associations. These guilds didn't just train apprentices. They provided complete economic security for their members, cradle to grave. A master stonemason didn't need to save for retirement. The guild maintained housing for elderly craftsmen, comfortable quarters where they lived out their days, surrounded by colleagues who respected their expertise. He didn't worry about his children's education. Guild schools taught the next generation reading, mathematics, and the foundations of the craft. Medical care, guild physicians treated members as part of the system. Funeral expenses, covered. Widow support, guaranteed for life. And the architecture they created, still standing, centuries later. While modern buildings crumble after decades, Notre Dame, Chartres Cathedral, the Church of St. Nicholas in Prague, constructed over 31 continuous years by thousands of skilled craftsmen working without wages as we understand them, no paychecks, no bank accounts, no debt. Think about what you pay for housing, healthcare, education, retirement savings, insurance. Think about the percentage of your income that goes to those expenses. 40%? 50%? More? Guild members paid nothing. Their contributions to their craft covered everything. A stonemason's family was protected from birth to death across generations without a single bank loan, without a single interest payment, without ever needing to borrow. None of this required currency in the way we understand it. The guild economy operated on contribution, not transaction. You worked to master a craft. You contributed that craft to collective projects. Your needs were provided in return, not based on how much you earned, based on what you needed. No debt, no interest payments, no bank loans. A cathedral that took 80 years to construct. Zero financing required. The workers weren't paid in gold. They were paid in security, in belonging, in the knowledge that their children and their children's children would be provided for. But this system had one fatal flaw. It didn't make bankers rich. The 1863 memo stated it explicitly. Communities operating under guild provision demonstrate immunity to debt-based capital control. Traditional banking mechanisms fail to penetrate guild-organized economies. Immunity, that's the word they used. Like the guilds were a disease to be eradicated. You cannot control people who don't need to borrow. You cannot extract wealth from communities that share resources collectively. You cannot charge interest to craftsmen whose needs are already provided. You cannot foreclose on families who don't have mortgages. You cannot profit from people who have already been provided for. The memo's directive was clear. Recommend aggressive displacement through industrialization mandates and monetary requirement legislation. Priority highest, timeline immediate. Aggressive displacement. Those are the words of bankers describing their plan for communities that threatened their business model. Not competition, displacement, elimination. There's a construction technique guildmasters used. Interlocking stone joints that required no mortar, no metal fasteners. The stones were cut with such precision that they locked together under their own weight. Earthquake resistant, fire resistant, requiring no maintenance for centuries. Modern engineers have studied these joints for decades. They've used computer modeling, laser measurements, diamond-tipped cutting tools. They still can't replicate the precision. The knowledge died with the guilds. I'll show you why that matters after we look at what was lost. Now look at what was reduced to ash in 1812. Moscow wasn't just a Russian city. It was one of the last great centers of traditional guild architecture. The edifices that burned weren't wooden shacks. They were stone monuments constructed by craftsmen using techniques passed down through generations. Libraries, containing construction manuals dating back centuries. Training facilities where master craftsmen passed knowledge to apprentices. the accumulated wisdom of 500 years. The counter-argument is simple. The Moscow conflagration was Russian scorched earth tactics. Military strategy, not conspiracy. Governor Rostopchin ordered the fires himself. But scorched earth explains Moscow. It doesn't explain why New York ignited the same year, or Caracas, or Delhi. Scorched earth is a military tactic, and it doesn't spread across oceans. It doesn't strike cities with no military significance on the same calendar. Remember Caracas? The priest who wrote that structures melted rather than collapsed? Caracas was the colonial capital of Spanish America, home to guild-trained architects who had constructed some of the most sophisticated stonework in the Western Hemisphere, churches with vaulted ceilings that had stood for 200 years, administrative edifices assembled using techniques brought from Spain's master builders, a center of craft knowledge for an entire continent. March 26, 1812. The entire city obliterated in hours. Official cause, earthquake. But earthquakes don't melt stonework. Earthquakes don't produce heat rising from below. Earthquakes cause buildings to fall. They don't cause stone to liquefy. They don't leave the ground scorched black. Every guild center, every knowledge repository, systematically targeted across 3 continents. Delhi was engulfed that same year. The British East India Company, but financed by London banks, by Rothschild-connected capital, oversaw the destruction of Mughal architecture that had taken centuries to construct. Craftsmen who had maintained monuments for generations were scattered. Training lineages that stretched back to the medieval period ended. Master builders who could construct earthquake-proof edifices without mortar, gone. Washington, D.C., in August 1814. British forces under Admiral George Cockburn torched the Capitol building. The heat grew so intense it melted the glass skylights. Carved stone was reduced to powder. The Library of Congress, every book, every document, every record, incinerated. Retaliation, or something more deliberate? The British claimed it was retaliation for American attacks in Canada. But look at what they specifically targeted. The Capitol House Congress, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court. The entire governmental structure of a nation that had rejected British banking control. A nation that had, just decades earlier, refused to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States, a bank with significant British investment, a bank the Rothschilds had helped establish. The White House was consumed so completely that only the exterior walls remained. The structure had to be torn down and mostly reconstructed. In a single year, 1812, flames destroyed the governmental centers of 2 continents and the architectural heritage of guild civilization across the northern hemisphere. The knowledge of centuries, the techniques of generations. And who financed the armies that supposedly caused all this destruction? The same family, on every side, on every continent. The counter-argument is that bankers simply profit from chaos they didn't create. Opportunists, not orchestrators. Lucky beneficiaries of random destruction. But the 1863 memo shows planning, not opportunism. Aggressive displacement, timeline immediate. Those aren't the words of observers. Those are directives, orders, strategy. Here's what happened after the flames stopped. Between 1865 and 1900, just 35 years, every economic system that didn't require banking was systematically dismantled through legislation. Not through competition, through law. Britain passed the Master and Servant Act in 1865. The law required all labor contracts to specify monetary wages. You could no longer legally work in exchange for provision, training, or access to collective resources. Every hour of labor had to be converted into currency. Currency that could be taxed, currency that could be borrowed, currency that could accumulate interest. France passed similar legislation in 1867, Germany in 1871, Italy in 1876, Austria in 1878, Spain in 1880. The pattern spreading across Europe like the fires had spread decades earlier. Country after country, year after year. Laws that forced the monetization of all labor relationships. Laws that made the old way illegal. The laws went further. Barter between individuals was classified as tax evasion. Guild provision systems were declared illegal monopolistic trusts. Collective ownership of property was forcibly privatized and sold, often to the banks themselves. I found a court case from 1873, documented in the historical records of the Worshipful Company. The Crown versus the Worshipful Company of Carpenters, a guild that had operated for over 400 years was formally charged with running an illegal economic system. Their defense? They'd been doing the exact same thing for generations. Their records showed continuous operation since 1477, almost 400 years of training craftsmen, housing elderly members, educating children, all without charging interest, all without bank involvement. 4 centuries of success. The court ruled against them. The guild was dissolved. Its properties were seized and auctioned. Its records were incinerated. 4 centuries of accumulated knowledge, Construction techniques, training methods, organizational structures reduced to ash in a single afternoon. The same pattern, the same destruction, the same result. Historians claim guilds simply couldn't compete with factories, that industrialization made them obsolete naturally, that progress required their elimination, but that ignores the laws. You don't need to criminalize something that's dying on its own. You don't need legislation to destroy something that can't compete. The legislation proves the guilds were functional threats, not obsolete relics. And something else happened, something economic historians avoid discussing. After the guilds disappeared, construction quality collapsed. The incredible craftsmanship that defined the 1700s and early 1800s became impossible to replicate. Not difficult, impossible. Remember the interlocking stone joints I mentioned? Guildmasters trained for decades to cut stone with that precision. When the guilds dissolved, the training lineages ended. The knowledge wasn't written in books. It passed from master to apprentice, hand to hand, generation to generation. You couldn't learn it from a manual. You learned it by watching, by doing, by failing and trying again under the guidance of someone who had mastered the technique over 40 years. When they incinerated the guild records, they didn't just destroy administrative paperwork, they destroyed centuries of accumulated technique. Construction methods that had taken 500 years to develop, erased in a single generation. Knowledge that cannot be recovered because the chain of transmission was deliberately broken. As if the banking system that replaced the guilds couldn't produce what guilds had created without debt at all. The monuments remained. Cathedrals constructed without bank loans. Palaces assembled without financial capital. Infrastructure created through contribution rather than transaction. Bridges that have carried traffic for 600 years without major repair. Aqueducts still functioning after 2 millennia. They stand today as physical evidence, undeniable proof that civilization functioned successfully, that it thrived, that it created transcendent beauty and lasting permanence, that humans are capable of building things that last, that we did it before, that we could do it again. All without the debt-based economy we're told is the only option. All without interest. All without loans. All without banks. So why don't you know this? Because the banking system didn't just eliminate the guild economy, it eliminated the memory of the guild economy. Schools teach that guilds were primitive, that currency is natural and inevitable, that there's no realistic alternative to debt-based economy, that the way we live now, working for wages, borrowing for homes, paying interest on everything, is simply how civilization works, how it has always worked, how it must work. But the stonework tells a different story. Every cathedral you've ever seen, every palace that still draws tourists, every structure from before 1812 that somehow endures, while modern construction crumbles after decades, they're proof that another way of organizing society existed and worked for centuries. Walk through any European city, the architecture from the 1700s, the Guild era still stands, solid, beautiful, proportioned in ways that feel right to the human. High, built to last forever. The stone hasn't cracked, the foundations haven't shifted, the roof lines haven't sagged, 300 years and counting. Now look at what was built in the 1900s. Look at what the banking system produced. Crumbling, requiring constant maintenance, scheduled for demolition after 70 or 80 years, built to fail. The difference isn't materials, it's motivation. Guild craftsmen built for permanence because their reputation, their entire economic security, depended on quality. Modern contractors build for profit because the banking system rewards speed over durability. Why construct something that lasts 300 years when you can construct something that needs replacing in 30? Replacement means new loans, new interest, new profit, permanent debt for permanent customers. The Rothschild banking dynasty became the most powerful financial institution of the 19th century. They possessed, according to historians, the largest private fortune in the world. More wealth than most nations, built on the ashes of 1812, built on the destruction of an alternative, built on ensuring there would be no other way. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the Kremlin walls and watched Moscow burn. He wrote to Tsar Alexander, "Beautiful, magical Moscow exists no more. How could you consign to destruction the loveliest city in the world?" He never received a reply, because Napoleon wasn't asking the right question. The question isn't who ignited the cities. The question is who financed the destruction, who profited from the ashes, who rebuilt a new economic order on the ruins of the old. The answer is still collecting interest today. Next time, the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were transported across America and distributed to families who needed labor. Where did they come from? Who were their parents? And why does no one remember them? Subscribe. The evidence is just beginning.